Welcome to Houston Baptist University's Psych 4326, The Psychology of Death and Dying. Reminder, these presentations are only intended to highlight some important or difficult points from the chapter. They are in no way comprehensive and do not include all the material that students will be held responsible for on exams. You are expected to completely and thoroughly engage with all the required learning materials. Exams in this course may include questions taken from the textbook reading, videos, and PowerPoint presentations. This presentation covers some important topics from Chapter 17 in our textbook. Make sure you read all the chapter and take notes. There is much more material in the chapter than we are covering in this presentation. For a death to be a suicide, the person carrying out the act must have the intention that the act will result in death. Determining the intention is not easy. What if someone drove too rapidly for road conditions and died when the car crashed? What about a diabetic who's been warned that they need to monitor their diet, but they fail to, and they die in a diabetic coma? Was this death intentional? Statistics on suicide rates may be inaccurate. Authorities are reluctant to call a death a suicide in order to give the person who died and the survivors the benefit of the doubt. They also want to protect family members from guilt and the social side. Even if our suicide rates are inaccurate, of the cases that are determined to be suicide, it's interesting to look at some of the data about who is committing suicide in America. By gender, women attempt more frequently than men. However, men are more successful when they attempt, since they usually use guns or more violent methods. Caucasians completed approximately 90% of all suicides in 2015. Age-wise, young people aged 15 to 24. Suicide was the second leading cause of death, accounting for 5,491 deaths. Among adults, suicide death rates peaked in middle adulthood and again in individuals over 85, especially white males. Make sure you take a look at the table 17.2 on page 497 in your textbook, covering the 10 commonalities of suicide. As far as explanations of suicide, make sure you take a look in your textbook. The psychological explanations are covered on pages 493 and 4. The biological explanations are covered on page 494 and 5. And the sociological explanations are listed on page 495 and include the egoistic suicide, altruistic suicide, anomic suicide, and fatalistic suicide. 3 elements of suicide. A common way to reflect the complexity of suicidal behavior is to consider it as involving 3 elements: haplessness, which means being ill-fated or lucky, helplessness, and hopelessness. For those who are left behind after a suicide, life and recovery are very difficult and complicated. It's different from losing someone to natural causes. They have that grief, plus several other difficulties to cope with. They wonder if it was avoidable, what they could have done to prevent it, what signs they failed to notice, and so on. They may blame themselves and experience severe guilt or feel rejected by the person who committed suicide. In addition, the death is sudden, and this makes dealing with the death more difficult, as it is so hard to gain closure when a death is sudden and unexpected. Make sure you look over table 17.3 on page 503 in your textbook to be able to discern which statements are facts and which are myths. Focus on 17.2 on page 505 in your textbook goes over some of the warning signs that people often exhibit when they are suicidal. The link to a video on how to help a friend who is feeling suicidal is here. You can find more suggestions in your textbook on page 506. Make sure you read Chapter 17 thoroughly and understand the terms found at the back of the chapter. There's so much more than we're covering in this presentation. See you in Chapter 18.